Hi, and welcome to the Knowledge Video channel. We help you become better informed by explaining all you need to know about the main periods of history, the latest topics and stories. In today's video, we are going to talk about the history of Portugal. If you like this content, don't forget to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. The history of Portugal can be traced from circa 400,000 years ago, when the region of present-day Portugal was inhabited by Homo heidelbergensis. In the south, the Cynetes lived in the Algarve and Lower Alentejo regions before the 6th century BC, developed the city of Tartessos and the written Tartessian language, and left many stelae in the south of the country. They dominated the northern and central area, while the south retained much of its Tartessian character, combined with the Celtici until the Roman conquest. The Roman invasion in the 3rd century BC lasted several centuries, and developed the Roman provinces of Lusitania in the south and Galicia in the north. Germanic tribes, that the Romans referred to as barbarians, controlled the territory between the 5th and 8th centuries. These included the kingdom of the Suebi centered in Braga and the Visigothic kingdom in the south. Eventually the Visigoths seized power in the whole of Iberia. Under the Visigoths a new class emerged, a nobility, which played a tremendous social and political role during the Middle Ages, and also began to play a very important part within the state. But since the Visigoths did not know Latin, the Catholic bishops continued the Roman system of governance. In 711 to 716 an invasion by the Islamic Umayyad Caliphate, comprising Berbers from North Africa and Arabs from the Middle East plus other Muslims from all around the Islamic world, conquered the Visigoth kingdom and founded the Islamic state of Al-Andalus. The Umayyads reigned supreme and advanced through Iberia and France until the Battle of Tours, 732, and endured in the south until the final reconquista of the Algarve, Garb al-Andalus, in 1294. Lisbon and the rest of what would become Portugal was reconquered by the early 12th century. At the end of the 9th century, a county based in the area of Portus Cale was established under King Alfonso III of Asturias, and by the 10th century, the counts were known as the Magnus Dux Portucalensium, Grand Duke of the Portuguese. Portucali, Portugal, Portugalii, the Kingdom of Asturias was later divided so that northern Portugal became part of the Kingdom of Leon. Initially a vassal of the Kingdom of Leon, Portugal grew in power and territory and gained de facto independence during weak Leonese reigns. In 1071 Garcia II of Galicia was declared King of Portugal, and in 1095, Portugal broke away from the Kingdom of Galicia. At the end of the 11th century, the Burgundian knight Henry became Count of Portugal and defended its independence by merging the County of Portugal and the County of Coimbra. Henry's son Afonso Henriques proclaimed himself Prince of Portugal on the 24th of June 1128 and King of Portugal in 1139 with Guimarães, Vimarantes, as capital. From the late Middle Ages, in the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal ascended to the status of a world power during Europe's Age of Discovery as it built up a vast empire, including possessions in South America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Over the following 2 centuries, Portugal kept most of its colonies, but gradually lost much of its wealth and status as the Dutch, English, and French took an increasing share of the spice and slave trades by surrounding or conquering the widely scattered Portuguese trading posts and territories. Signs of military decline began with 2 disastrous battles, the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in Morocco in 1578 and Spain's abortive attempt to conquer England in 1588 by means of the Spanish Armada. Portugal was then in an uncomfortable dynastic union with Spain and contributed ships to the Spanish invasion fleet. From the middle of the 19th century to the late 1950s, nearly 2. Portugal is a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the European Free Trade Association, EFTA. The region of present-day Portugal has been inhabited by humans since circa 400,000 years ago, when Homo heidelbergensis entered the area. The oldest human fossil found in Portugal is the 400,000-year-old Aurora 3H. Homo sapiens sapiens arrived in Portugal around 35,000 years ago and spread rapidly throughout the country. Pre-Celtic tribes inhabited Portugal, leaving a remarkable cultural footprint. The Cynetes developed a written language, leaving many stelae, which are mainly found in the south of Portugal. Early in the 1st millennium BC, several waves of Celts invaded Portugal from Central Europe and intermarried with the local populations to form several different ethnic groups, with many tribes. The Celtic presence in Portugal is traceable, in broad outline, through archaeological and linguistic evidence. They dominated much of northern and central Portugal. In southern Portugal, some small, semi-permanent commercial coastal settlements were also founded by Phoenician Carthaginians. Numerous pre-Roman peoples of the Iberian Peninsula inhabited the territory when a Roman invasion occurred in the 3rd century BC. The Roman provinces that covered present-day Portugal were Lusitania in the south and Galicia in the north. Numerous Roman sites are scattered around present-day Portugal. Romanization began with the arrival of the Roman army in the Iberian Peninsula in 218 BC during the Second Punic War against Carthage. The Romans sought to conquer Lusitania, a territory that included all of modern Portugal south of the Douro River, and Spanish Extremadura, with its capital at Emerita Augusta, now Merida. Mining was the primary factor that made the Romans interested in conquering the region. One of Rome's strategic objectives was to cut off Carthaginian access to the Iberian copper, tin, gold, and silver mines. The Romans intensely exploited the Aljustrel, Vipasca, and Santo Domingo mines in the Iberian Pyrite Belt, which extends to Seville. While the south of what is now Portugal was relatively easily occupied by the Romans, the conquest of the north was achieved only with difficulty due to resistance from Serra da Estrela by Celts and Lusitanians led by Viriatus, who managed to resist Roman expansion for years. Viriatus, a shepherd from Serra da Estrela who was expert in guerrilla tactics, waged relentless war against the Romans, defeating several successive Roman generals, until he was assassinated in 140 BC by traitors bought by the Romans. The conquest of the Iberian Peninsula was complete 2 centuries after the Roman arrival, when they defeated the remaining Cantabria, Asturias and Galicia in the Cantabrian Wars in the time of Emperor Augustus, 19 BC. In 212 AD, the Constitutio Antoniniana gave Roman citizenship to all free subjects of the empire and, at the end of the century, the Emperor Diocletian founded the province of Galicia, which included modern-day northern Portugal, with its capital at Bracara Augusta, now Braga. As well as mining, the Romans also developed agriculture, on some of the best agricultural land in the empire. In what is now Alentejo, vines and cereals were cultivated, and fishing was intensively pursued in the coastal belt of the Algarve, Póvoa de Varzim, Matosinhos, Troia and the coast of Lisbon, for the manufacture of garum that was exported by Roman trade routes to the entire empire. Roman rule brought geographical mobility to the inhabitants of Portugal and increased their interaction with the rest of the world as well as internally. The Romans founded numerous cities, such as Olisipo, Lisbon, Bracara Augusta, Braga, Eminium, Coimbra, and Pax Julia, Beja, and left important cultural legacies in what is now Portugal. In 409, with the decline of the Roman Empire, the Iberian Peninsula was occupied by Germanic tribes that the Romans referred to as barbarians. An important group was made up of the Suebi and Vandals in Galicia, who founded a Suebi kingdom with its capital in Braga. They came to dominate Eminium, Coimbra, as well, and there were Visigoths to the south. The Suebi and the Visigoths were the Germanic tribes who had the most lasting presence in the territories corresponding to modern Portugal. Roman institutions disappeared in the wake of the Germanic invasions with the exception of ecclesiastical organizations, which were fostered by the Suebi in the 5th century and adopted by the Visigoths afterwards. Although the Suebi and Visigoths were initially followers of Arianism and Priscillianism, they adopted Catholicism from the local inhabitants. In 429, the Visigoths moved south to expel the Alans and Vandals and founded a kingdom with its capital in Toledo. From 470, conflict between the Suebi and Visigoths increased. With the Visigoths settled in the newly formed kingdom, a new class emerged that had been unknown in Roman times, a nobility, which played a tremendous social and political role during the Middle Ages. It was also under the Visigoths that the church began to play a very important part within the state. Since the Visigoths did not learn Latin from the local people, they had to rely on Catholic bishops to continue the Roman system of governance. During the caliphate of the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walidi, the Berber commander Tariq ibn Ziyad led a small force that landed at Gibraltar on the 30th of April 711, ostensibly to intervene in a Visigothic civil war. After a decisive victory over King Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete on the 19th of July 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad, joined by the Arab governor Musa ibn Nusayr of Afriqiya, brought most of the Visigothic kingdom under Muslim occupation in a 7-year campaign. This is in part because the ruling Visigoth population is estimated at a mere 1 to 2% of the total population. The invading Moors wanted to conquer and convert all of Europe to Islam, so they crossed the Pyrenees to use Visigothic Septimania as a base of operations. Muslims called their conquests in Iberia Al-Andalus, and in what was to become Portugal, they mainly consisted of the old Roman province of Lusitania, the central and southern regions of the country, while Galicia, the northern regions, remained unsubbed. The invading medieval Muslim Moors, who conquered and destroyed the Christian Visigothic kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, were mainly Berbers from North Africa, but they were joined by Arabs from the Middle East. By 718 most of today's Portuguese territory was under Umayyad rule. The Umayyads eventually stopped in Poitiers, but Muslim rule in Iberia would last until 1492 with the fall of the Kingdom of Granada. For the next several centuries, much of the Iberian Peninsula remained under Umayyad rule. Much of the populace was allowed to remain Christian, and many of the lesser feudal rulers worked out deals where they would submit to Umayyad rule in order to remain in power. But some regions, including Lisbon, Garb al-Andalus, and the rest of what would become Portugal, rebelled, succeeded in freeing themselves by the early 10th century, p. Currently, historians and archaeologists generally agree that northern Portugal between the Minho and the Douro rivers kept a significant share of its population, a social and political Christian area that until the late 9th century had no acting state powers. However, in the late 9th century, the region became part of a complex of powers, the Galician Asturian, Leonese and Portuguese power structures. At the end of the 9th century, a small minor county based in the area of Portas Cale was established by Vimara Perez on the orders of King Alfonso III of Leon, Galicia and Asturias. After annexing the county of Portugal into one of the several counties that made up its realms, King Alfonso III named Vimara Perez as its first count. Since the rule of Count Diogo Fernandes, the county increased in size and importance and, from the 10th century onward, with Count Goncalo Mendes as Magnus Dux Portucalensium, Grand Duke of the Portuguese count started using the title of Duke, indicating even larger importance and territory. The region became known simultaneously as Portucali, Portugal, and Portugalia, the County of Portugal. The northern region of Portugal became part of the Kingdom of Galicia and later part of the Kingdom of Leon. As a vassal of the Kingdom of Leon, Portugal grew in power and territory and occasionally gained de facto independence during weak Leonese reigns. In 1070, the Portuguese Count Nuno Mendes desired the Portuguese title and fought the Battle of Pedroso on the 18th of February 1071 with Garcia II of Galicia, who gained the Galician title, which included Portugal, after the 1065 partition of the Leonese realms. The battle resulted in Nuno Mendes' death and the declaration of Garcia as King of Portugal, the first person to claim this title. Garcia styled himself as King of Portugal and Galicia, Garcia Rex Portugalae et Galiciae. Garcia's brothers, Sancho II of Castile and Alfonso VI of Leon, united and annexed Garcia's kingdom in 1071 as well. Alfonso took Castile for himself and Garcia recovered his kingdom of Portugal and Galicia. When the emperor died, the crown was left to his daughter Urraca, while his illegitimate daughter Teresa inherited the county of Portugal. In 1095, Portugal broke away from the Kingdom of Galicia. At the end of the 11th century, the Burgundian knight Henry became Count of Portugal and defended its independence by merging the county of Portugal and the county of Coimbra. Henry's son Afonso Henriques took control of the county upon his death. Lords of the cities of Coimbra and Porto fought with Braga's clergy and demanded the independence of the reconstituted county. Portugal traces its national origin to the 24th of June 1128, the date of the Battle of São Maimed. Afonso proclaimed himself Prince of Portugal after this battle, and in 1139, he assumed the title King of Portugal. In 1143, the Kingdom of Leon recognized him as King of Portugal by the Treaty of Zamora. After the Battle of São Maimed, the first capital of Portugal was Guimarães, from which the first king ruled. Later, when Portugal was already officially independent, he ruled from Coimbra. The Algarve, the southernmost region of Portugal, was finally conquered from the Moors in 1249, and in 1255 the capital shifted to Lisbon. Portugal's land boundaries have been notably stable for the rest of the country's history. The Treaty of Windsor, 1386, created an alliance between Portugal and England that remains in effect to this day. During the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal became a leading European power that ranked with England, France and Spain in terms of economic, political and cultural influence. Though not dominant in European affairs, Portugal did have an extensive colonial trading empire throughout the world backed by a powerful thalassocracy. The beginnings of the Portuguese Empire can be traced to the 25th of July 1415, when the Portuguese Armada set sail for the rich Islamic trading center of Ceuta in North Africa. The Armada was accompanied by King John I, his sons Prince Duarte, a future king, Prince Pedro, and Prince Henry the Navigator, and the legendary Portuguese hero Nuno Álvares Pereira. On the 21st of August 1415, Ceuta was conquered by Portugal, and the long-lived Portuguese Empire was founded. This civil war prevented a recapture of Ceuta from the Portuguese, when the King of Granada Muhammad IX, the left-handed, laid siege to Ceuta and attempted to coordinate forces in Morocco and attract aid and assistance for the effort from Tunis. The Muslim attempt to retake Ceuta was ultimately unsuccessful, and Ceuta remained the first part of the new Portuguese Empire. Further steps were taken that would soon expand the Portuguese Empire much further. In 1418, two of Prince Henry the Navigator's captains, João Goncalves Zarco and Tristão Vaz Teixeira, were driven by a storm to an island that they called Porto Santo, Holy Port, in gratitude for their rescue from the shipwreck. Uninhabited Madeira was colonized by the Portuguese in 1420. Between 1427 and 1431, most of the Azores were discovered, and these uninhabited islands were colonized by the Portuguese in 1445. Portuguese expeditions may have attempted to colonize the Canary Islands as early as 1336, but the Crown of Castile objected to any Portuguese claim to them. Castile expelled the last Portuguese from the Canary Islands in 1459, and they would eventually become part of the Spanish Empire. The trip marked the beginning of the Portuguese exploration of Africa. Some setbacks occurred. In 1436 the Canaries were officially recognized as Castilian by the Pope. Earlier they had been recognized as Portuguese. In 1438, the Portuguese were defeated in a military expedition to Tangier. These setbacks did not deter the Portuguese from pursuing their exploratory efforts. Some time later, the caravels explored the Gulf of Guinea, which led to the discovery of several uninhabited islands, Cape Verde, São Tomé, Príncipe and Annobon. He had been the leading patron of maritime exploration by Portugal, and immediately following his death, exploration lapsed. Henry's patronage had shown that profits could be made from the trade that followed the discovery of new lands. In the 1470s, Portuguese trading ships reached the Gold Coast. In 1471, the Portuguese captured Tangier, after years of attempts. Christopher Columbus set sail aboard the fleet of ships taking materials and building crews to Elmina in December 1481. In 1483, Diogo Cao reached and explored the Congo River. In 1484, Portugal officially rejected Columbus' idea of reaching India from the west, because it was seen as unfeasible. Some historians have claimed that the Portuguese had already performed fairly accurate calculations concerning the size of the world, and therefore knew that sailing west to reach the Indies would require a far longer journey than navigating to the east. The treaty divided the, largely undiscovered, New World equally between the Portuguese and the Castilians, along a north-south meridian line 370 leagues, 1,770 kilometers per 1,100 miles, west of the Cape Verde Islands, with all lands to the east belonging to Portugal and all lands to the west to Castile. With the expedition beyond the Cape of Good Hope by Bartholomew Diaz in 1487, the richness of India was now accessible. Indeed, the Cape takes its name from the promise of rich trade with the East. At the same time, Pero da Covilhã reached Ethiopia by land. Vasco da Gama sailed for India and arrived at Calicut on the 20th of May 1498, returning in glory to Portugal the next year. At the end of the 15th century, Portugal expelled some local Sephardic Jews, along with those refugees who had come from Castile and Aragon after 1492. Many Jews remained secretly Jewish, in danger of persecution by the Portuguese Inquisition. In the spring of 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral set sail from Cape Verde with 13 ships and crews and nobles such as Nicolau Coelho. From Cape Verde, they sailed southwest across the Atlantic. This was the coast of what would later become the Portuguese colony of Brazil. The real goal of the expedition, however, was to open sea trade to the empires of the East. Trade with the East had effectively been cut off since the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Cabral reached Sofala on the east coast of Africa in July 1500. In 1505, a Portuguese fort was established here, and the land around the fort would later become the Portuguese colony of Mozambique. Cabral's fleet then sailed east and landed in Calicut in India in September 1500. Here they traded for pepper and, more significantly, opened European sea trade with the empires of the East. No longer would the Muslim Ottoman occupation of Constantinople form a barrier between Europe and the East. 10 years later, in 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque, after attempting and failing to capture and occupy Zamorin's Calicut militarily, conquered Goa on the west coast of India. In 1505, Francisco de Almeida was engaged to improve Portuguese trade with the Far East. Accordingly, he sailed to East Africa. By the 16th century, the 2 million people who lived in the original Portuguese lands ruled a vast empire with many millions of inhabitants in the Americas, Africa, the Middle East and Asia. Mauritius was discovered in 1507, Socotra occupied in 1506, and in the same year, Lorenzo de Almeida visited Ceylon. In the Red Sea, Mar Sorwa was the most northerly point frequented by the Portuguese until 1541, when a fleet under Estevão da Gama penetrated as far as Suez. In 1521, a force under Antonio Correa conquered Bahrain and ushered in a period of almost 80 years of Portuguese rule of the Persian Gulf archipelago, p. East of Malacca, Albuquerque sent Duarte Fernandez as envoy to Siam, now Thailand, in 1511 and dispatched to the Moluccas 2 expeditions, 1512, 1514, which founded the Portuguese dominion in maritime Southeast Asia. On the 4th of August 1578, while fighting in Morocco, young King Sebastian died in the Battle of Alcácer without an heir. The late king's elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, then became king. Portugal was worried about the maintenance of its independence and sought help to find a new king. One of the claimants to the throne, Antonio, Prior of Crato, a bastard son of Infante Louis, Duke of Beja, and only grandson through the male line of King Manuel I of Portugal, lacked support from the clergy and most of the nobility, but was acclaimed as king in Santarém and in some other towns in June 1580. Philip II of Spain, through his mother Isabella of Portugal, also a grandson of Manuel I, claimed the Portuguese throne and did not recognize Antonio as King of Portugal. The king appointed Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, 3rd Duke of Alba, as captain general of his army. The Duke was 73 years old and ill at the time, but Fernando mustered his forces, estimated at 20,000 men, in Badajoz, and in June 1580 crossed the Spanish-Portuguese border and moved towards Lisbon. The Duke of Alba met little resistance and in July set up his forces at Cascais, west of Lisbon. West of the small brook Alcantara, the Spanish encountered a Portuguese force on the eastern side of it, commanded by Antonio, Prior of Crato, a grandson of King Manuel I of Portugal who had proclaimed himself king, and his lieutenant Francisco de Portugal, 3rd Count of Vimioso. In late August, the Duke of Alba defeated Antonio's force, a ragtag army assembled in a hurry and composed mainly of local peasants, and freed slaves at the Battle of Alcantara. 2 days later, the Duke of Alba captured Lisbon, and on the 25th of March 1581, Philip II of Spain was crowned King of Portugal in Tomar as Philip I. Philip rewarded the Duke of Alba with the titles of First Viceroy of Portugal on the 18th of July 1580 and Constable of Portugal in 1581. With these titles, the Duke of Alba represented the Spanish monarch in Portugal and was second in hierarchy only after King Philip in Portugal. The Portuguese and Spanish empires came under a single rule, but resistance to Spanish rule in Portugal did not come to an end. Sebastianism, the myth that the young king will return to Portugal on a foggy day, has prevailed until modern times. After the 16th century, Portugal gradually saw its wealth and influence decrease. Portugal was officially an autonomous state, but in actuality, the country was in a personal union with the Spanish crown from 1580 to 1640. The Council of Portugal remained independent inasmuch as it was one of the key administrative units of the Castilian monarchy, legally on equal terms with the Council of the Indies. The joining of the two crowns deprived Portugal of a separate foreign policy, and the enemies of Spain became the enemies of Portugal. England had been an ally of Portugal since the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, but war between Spain and England led to a deterioration of the relations with Portugal's oldest ally and the loss of Hormuz in 1622. The Dutch intrusion into Brazil was long-lasting and troublesome to Portugal. The Dutch captured the entire coast except that of Bahia and much of the interior of the contemporary northeastern Brazilian states of Bahia, Sergipe, Alagoas, Pernambuco, Paraíba, Rio Grande do Norte and Serra, while Dutch privateers sacked Portuguese ships in both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The other smaller, less developed areas were recovered in stages and relieved of Dutch piracy in the next 2 decades by local resistance and Portuguese expeditions. After the dissolution of the Iberian Union in 1640, Portugal would re-establish its authority over some lost territories of the Portuguese Empire. At home, life was calm and serene under the first 2 Spanish kings, Philip II and Philip III. They maintained Portugal's status, gave excellent positions to Portuguese nobles in the Spanish courts, and Portugal maintained an independent law, currency and government. Later, Philip IV tried to make Portugal a Spanish province, and Portuguese nobles lost power. Because of this, as well as the general strain on the finances of the Spanish throne as a result of the 30 Years' War, the Duke of Braganza, one of the great native noblemen and a descendant of King Manuel I, was proclaimed King of Portugal as John IV on the 1st of December 1640, and a war of independence against Spain was launched. From 1709, John V prohibited emigration, since Portugal had lost a sizable proportion of its population. In 1738, Sebastião de Melo, the talented son of a Lisbon squire, began a diplomatic career as the Portuguese ambassador in London and later in Vienna. The Queen Regent of Portugal, Maria Anna of Austria, was fond of de Melo. King John V of Portugal, however, was not pleased and recalled Melo to Portugal in 1749. John V died the following year, and his son Joseph I of Portugal was crowned. In contrast to his father, Joseph I was fond of de Melo, and with the Maria Anna's approval, he appointed Melo as Minister of Foreign Affairs. As the king's confidence in de Melo increased, he entrusted him with more control of the state. By 1755, Sebastião de Melo was made Prime Minister. Impressed by British economic success he had witnessed while ambassador, he successfully implemented similar economic policies in Portugal. He abolished slavery in Portugal and in the Portuguese colonies in India, and ended discrimination against different Christian sects in Portugal. But Sebastião de Melo's greatest reforms were economic and financial, with the creation of several companies and guilds to regulate every commercial activity. Disaster fell upon Portugal in the morning of the 1st of November 1755, when Lisbon was struck by a violent earthquake with an estimated Richter scale magnitude of 9. The city was razed to the ground by the earthquake and the subsequent tsunami and fires. De Melo survived by a stroke of luck and immediately embarked on rebuilding the city, with his famous quote, "What now?" The new Lisbon downtown was designed to resist subsequent earthquakes. The buildings and big squares of the Pombalene downtown of Lisbon still remain as one of Lisbon's tourist attractions. They represent the world's first earthquake-resistant structures. Sebastião de Melo also made an important contribution to the study of seismology by designing an inquiry that was sent to every parish in the country. Following the earthquake, Joseph I gave his prime minister even more power, and Sebastião de Melo became a powerful, progressive dictator. Sebastião de Melo showed no mercy and prosecuted every person involved, even women and children. Based upon his swift resolve, Joseph I made his loyal minister Count of Oeiras in 1759. Made Marquis of Pombal in 1770, he effectively ruled Portugal until Joseph I's death in 1779. However, historians also argue that Pombal's enlightenment and economic progress, while far-reaching, was primarily a mechanism for enhancing autocracy at the expense of individual liberty and an apparatus for crushing opposition, suppressing criticism, furthering colonial exploitation, intensifying book censorship and consolidating personal control and profit. The new ruler, Queen Maria I of Portugal, disliked the Marquis, Tavora affair, and forbade him from coming within 20 miles of her, thus curtailing his influence. In 1707, as part of the War of the Spanish Succession, a joint Portuguese, Dutch, and British army, led by the Marquis of Minas, Antonio Luis de Sousa, conquered Madrid and acclaimed the Archduke Charles of Austria as King Charles III of Spain. Along the route to Madrid, the army led by the Marquis of Minas was successful in conquering Ciudad Rodrigo and Salamanca. In 1762, France and Spain tried to urge Portugal to join the Bourbon family compact by claiming that Great Britain had become too powerful due to its successes in the 7 Years' War. In spring 1762, Spanish and French troops invaded Portugal from the north as far as the Douro, while a second column sponsored the siege of Almeida, captured the city, and threatened to advance on Lisbon. The arrival of a force of British troops helped the Portuguese army commanded by the Count of Lip by blocking the Franco-Spanish advance and driving them back across the border following the Battle of Valencia de Alcantara. At the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Spain agreed to hand Almeida back to Portugal. British intervention in the Peninsular War helped in maintaining Portuguese independence. The war cost Portugal the town of Olivença, now governed by Spain. Lisbon regained its status as the capital of Portugal when Brazil declared its independence from Portugal in 1822. His eldest son, Pedro I of Brazil, briefly became Pedro IV of Portugal, but neither the Portuguese nor the Brazilians wanted a unified monarchy. This led to the Liberal Wars, in which Pedro eventually forced Miguel to abdicate and go into exile in 1834 and place his daughter on throne as Queen Maria II. The 1890 British ultimatum was delivered to Portugal on the 11th of January of that year, an attempt to force the retreat of Portuguese military forces in the land between the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique and Angola, most of present-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. The area had been claimed by Portugal, which included it in its pink map, but this clashed with British aspirations to create a railroad link between Cairo and Cape Town, thereby linking its colonies from the north of Africa to the far south. The 1890 British ultimatum was considered by Portuguese historians and politicians at that time to be the most outrageous and infamous action of the British against her oldest ally. After 1815, the Portuguese expanded their trading ports along the African coast, moving inland to take control of Angola and Mozambique. The slave trade was abolished in 1836, in part because many foreign slave ships were flying the Portuguese flag. In Portuguese India, trade flourished in the colony of Goa, with its subsidiary colonies of Macau, near Hong Kong on the China coast, and Timor, north of Australia. The Portuguese successfully introduced Catholicism and the Portuguese language into their colonies, while most settlers continued to head to Brazil. This historian posited the Jacobin and urban nature of the revolution carried out by the Portuguese Republican Party, PRP, and claimed that the PRP had turned the Republican regime into a de facto dictatorship. This vision clashes with an older interpretation of the First Republic as a progressive and increasingly democratic regime that presented a clear contrast to Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's ensuing dictatorship. Historian Stanley Payne points out, the majority of Republicans took the position that Catholicism was the number one enemy of individualistic middle-class radicalism and must be completely broken as a source of influence in Portugal. Under the leadership of Afonso Costa, the justice minister, the revolution immediately targeted the Catholic Church. Churches were plundered, convents were attacked and clergy were harassed. Scarcely had the provisional government been installed when it began devoting its entire attention to an anti-religious policy, in spite of the disastrous economic situation. On the 10th of October, 5 days after the inauguration of the Republic, the new government decreed that all convents, monasteries and religious orders were to be suppressed. The Jesuits were forced to forfeit their Portuguese citizenship. On the 3rd of November, a law legalizing divorce was passed, and then there were laws to recognize the legitimacy of children born outside wedlock, authorize cremation, secularize cemeteries, suppress religious teaching in the schools and prohibit the wearing of the cassock. The Republic provoked important fractures within Portuguese society, notably among the essentially monarchist rural population, in the trade unions, and in the church. Even the PRP had to endure the secession of its more moderate elements, who formed conservative Republican parties like the Evolutionist Party and the Republican Union. In spite of these splits, the PRP, led by Afonso Costa, preserved its dominance, largely due to a brand of clientelist politics inherited from the monarchy. Nevertheless, an essay by Vasco Pulido Valente should be consulted, 1997a, as should the attempt to establish the political, social, and economic context made by M. The PRP viewed the outbreak of the First World War as a unique opportunity to achieve a number of goals, putting an end to the twin threats of a Spanish invasion of Portugal and a foreign occupation of the African colonies and, at the internal level, creating a national consensus around the regime and even around the party. These domestic objectives were not met, since participation in the conflict was not the subject of a national consensus and since it did not therefore serve to mobilize the population. Quite the opposite occurred. Existing lines of political and ideological fracture were deepened by Portugal's intervention in the First World War. The lack of consensus around Portugal's intervention in turn made possible the appearance of two dictatorships, led by General Pimenta de Castro, January-May 1915, and Sidonio Pais, December 1917 to December 1918. Sidonismo, also known as Decembrismo, aroused a strong interest among historians, largely as a result of the elements of modernity that it contained. Antonio José Tello has made clear the way in which this regime predated some of the political solutions invented by the totalitarian and fascist dictatorships of the 1920s and 1930s. Sidonio Pais undertook the rescue of traditional values, notably the patria, homeland, and attempted to rule in a charismatic fashion. A move was made to abolish traditional political parties and to alter the existing mode of national representation in parliament, which, it was claimed, exacerbated divisions within the patria, through the creation of a corporative senate, the founding of a single party, the National Republican Party, and the attribution of a mobilizing function to the leader. Sidonio Pais also attempted to restore public order and to overcome some of the rifts of the recent past, making the republic more acceptable to monarchists and Catholics. A Republican coalition government, led by José Relvas, coordinated the struggle against the monarchists by loyal army units and armed civilians. This military victory allowed the PRP to return to government and to emerge triumphant from the elections held later that year, having won the usual absolute majority. In August 1919 a conservative president was elected, Antonio José de Almeida, whose evolutionist party had come together in wartime with the PRP to form a flawed, because incomplete, sacred union, and his office was given the power to dissolve parliament. The president used his new power to resolve a crisis of government in May 1921, naming a liberal government, the Liberal Party being the result of the post-war fusion of evolutionists and unionists, to prepare the forthcoming elections. These were held on the 10th of July 1921, with victory going, as was usually the case, to the party in power. On the 19th of October a military pronunciamento was carried out during which, and apparently against the wishes of the coup's leaders, a number of prominent conservative figures, including Prime Minister Antonio Granjo, were assassinated. There could be no greater demonstration of the essential fragility of the Republic's institutions and proof that the regime was democratic in name only, since it did not even admit the possibility of the rotation in power characteristic of the elitist regimes of the 19th century. A new round of elections on the 29th of January 1922 inaugurated a fresh period of stability. The PRP once again emerged from the contest with an absolute majority. Numerous accusations of corruption, and the manifest failure to resolve pressing social concerns wore down the more visible PRP leaders while making the opposition's attacks more deadly. At the same time, moreover, all political parties suffered from growing internal factionalism, especially the PRP itself. This is clearly shown by the fact that regular PRP victories at the ballot box did not lead to stable government. The opposition of presidents to single-party governments, internal dissent within the PRP, the party's almost non-existent internal discipline, and its desire to group together and lead all Republican forces made any government's task practically impossible. Force was clearly the sole means open to the opposition if the PRP wanted to enjoy the fruits of power. For many who had helped, supported or simply cheered the Republic in 1910, hoping that the new political situation would repair the monarchy's flaws, government instability, financial crisis, economic backwardness and civic anomie, the conclusion to be drawn, in the 1920s, was that the remedy for national maladies called for much more than the simple removal of the king. Sardica, however, also points out the permanent impact of the Republican experiment of p. Since the opposition's constitutional route to power was blocked by the various means deployed by the PRP to protect itself, it turned to the army for support. The political awareness of the armed forces had grown during the war, and many of their leaders had not forgiven the PRP for sending them to a war they did not want to fight. Links were established between conservative figures and military officers, who added their own political and corporative demands to the already complex equation. The 28th of May 1926 coup d'état enjoyed the support of most army units and even of most political parties. Nevertheless, much has been written about the crisis and fall of the regime under the 28th of May movement. For some historians, the First Republic was a progressive and increasingly democratic regime. Political chaos, several strikes, harsh relations with the church, and considerable economic problems aggravated by a disastrous military intervention in the First World War led to the 28th of May 1926 coup d'état. This coup installed the Second Republic, which started as the Ditadura Nacional, national dictatorship, and became the Estado Novo, new state, in 1933, led by economist Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. He transformed Portugal into a sort of fascist regime that evolved into a single-party corporative regime. Portugal, although neutral, informally aided the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War, 1936–39. Salazar's policy after the war was to provide a certain level of liberalization in politics, in terms of organized opposition with more freedom of the press. Opposition parties were tolerated to an extent, but they were also controlled, limited, and manipulated, with the result that they split into factions and never formed a united opposition. Portugal was officially neutral in World War II, but in practice Salazar collaborated with the British and sold them rubber and tungsten. However, as tungsten was a major product of Portugal, it was also sold to Germany until June 1944, when the threat of a German attack on Portugal was minimal. Salazar worked to regain control of East Timor after the Japanese had seized it. In 1961, the Portuguese army was involved in armed action in its colony in Goa against an Indian invasion, see Operation VJ. The operations resulted in a Portuguese defeat and the loss of the colonies in India. Independence movements also became active in Portuguese Angola, Portuguese Mozambique and Portuguese Guinea. The Portuguese colonial war started. However, the colonial wars in Africa continued, political prisoners remained incarcerated, freedom of association was not restored, censorship was only slightly eased and the elections remained tightly controlled. The regime retained its characteristic traits, censorship, corporateness, with a market economy dominated by a handful of economical groups, continuous surveillance and intimidation of several sectors of society through the use of a political police and techniques instilling fear, such as arbitrary imprisonment, systematic political persecution and even assassination of anti-regime insurgents. The Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974, an effectively bloodless left-wing military coup, installed the Third Republic. Third Portuguese Republic. In 1975, Portugal granted independence to its overseas provinces, Províncias Ultramarinas in Portuguese, in Africa, Portuguese Mozambique, Portuguese Angola, Portuguese Guinea, Portuguese Cape Verde and Portuguese São Tomé and Príncipe. Nearly 1 million Portuguese or persons of Portuguese descent left these former colonies as refugees. In 1975, Indonesia invaded and annexed the Portuguese province of Portuguese Timor, Timor-Leste, in Asia before independence could be granted. The massive exodus of the Portuguese military and citizens from Angola and Mozambique would prompt an era of chaos and severe destruction in those territories after independence from Portugal in 1975. From May 1974 to the end of the 1970s, over 1 million Portuguese citizens from Portugal's African territories, mostly from Portuguese Angola and Mozambique, left those territories as destitute refugees, the retornados. Portugal applied international pressure to secure East Timor's independence from Indonesia, as East Timor was still legally a Portuguese dependency, and recognized as such by the United Nations. After a referendum in 1999, East Timor voted for independence, which Portugal recognized in 2002. With the 1975-76 independence of its colonies, apart from Macau, the 560-year-old Portuguese Empire effectively ended. Many Portuguese returned from the colonies, the retornados, and came to comprise a sizable proportion of the population, approximately 580,000 of Portugal's 9. In 1986, Portugal entered the European Economic Community and left the European Free Trade Association, which had been founded by Portugal and its partners in 1960. The Portuguese Empire ended de facto in 1999 when Macau was returned to China, and de jure in 2002 when East Timor became independent. Economic development was one of the major objectives of the Carnation Revolution, and it was widely perceived that the new democracy would have the same unfortunate fate of the previous democratic regimes in Portugal, constitutional monarchy and First Republic, if, like them, it failed to provide economic development and decent standards of living to its citizens. Relative to Western Europe, Portugal remained stagnant, and thus poor and underdeveloped, for most of the Estado Novo regime, particularly in the first 30 years, but the modernization of the economy and development of the country still started in the last years of the regime, with a period of strong growth from 1961 to 1973. Overall, the Third Republic gave continuity to the growth started in the 1960s and was marked by a major socio-economic development, particularly until the early 2000s. However, as of 2019, Portugal still has not converged with the most advanced economies of Central and Northern Europe, as the economy has been stagnant since the early 2000s. In order to understand the economic lag of Portugal, it is worthwhile to note that, overall, the Portuguese economy declined in the centuries following the end of the Age of Discoveries, and neither the constitutional monarchy, 1834 to 1910, nor the First Republic, 1910 to 26, were able to put the country in the path to industrialization and development. While Western world enjoyed strong economic growth, Portugal remained behind. As such, by 1960 the Portuguese GDP per capita was only 38% of the EC12 average, and Portugal was one of the most backward countries in Europe. However, things started to change in the late Estado Novo. Starting in the early 1960s, Portugal entered in a period of robust economic growth and structural modernization, owing to a liberalization of the economy and the rise of a new elite, which was developmental, technocratic and politically liberal. As an expression of such economic opening, in 1960 Portugal was one of the EFTA founding member states. Such remarkable growth period allowed the Portuguese GDP per capita to reach 56% of the EC12 average by 1973. In the early 1970s, the government of Marcelo Caetano paved some foundations for a welfare state, which actually was only built after the April 25, 1974 revolution, with reforms in health, Goncalves Ferreira reform, and education, Veiga Simu reform. However, the political turmoil following the April 25, 1974 coup, mainly from March to November 1975, definitively led to the end of such economic growth period. Portugal lost suddenly and chaotically its African possessions, and from May 1974 to the end of the 1970s, over 1 million Portuguese citizens from Portugal's African territories, mostly from Portuguese Angola and Mozambique, left those territories and arrived at metropolitan Portugal as destitute refugees, the retornados. The first 10 years of the Third Republic, in the context of the transition to democracy, were years of economic troubles, during which Portugal received 2 IMF-monitored bailouts, from 1977 to 1979 and from 1983 to 1985. However, despite an overall crisis from 1973 to 1985, there were some years of very high economic growth, and reforms were enacted that allowed to improve standards of living and level of development, such as the construction of a true social security scheme, universal health coverage and the continuation of the process of increasing access to education. In 1985 Portugal left the second IMF bailout, and in 1986 the country entered the European Economic Community, and left the EFTA. The growth of many of Portugal's main exporting companies and the European Union structural and cohesion funds were leading forces in a new period of robust economic growth and socio-economic development which would last, though with a short crisis around 1992 to 94, to the early 2000s. However, the economy has been stagnant since the early 2000s, around the accession to Euro, and was hit hard by the effects of the Great Recession. Public debt, historically below or in average to that of Europe and Germany, shot up from 68% of GDP in 2007 to 126% in 2012, which was one of the factors that led to a €78 billion IMF, EU-monitored bailout from 2011 to 2014. Portuguese GDP per capita was at 54% of the average of Northern and Central European countries in 1975, up from 38% in 1960, owing to the remarkable growth in the 1960s and early 1970s, more or less the same level it was 10 years later, owing to the crisis, from when it rose from 55% in 1985 to a virtually unprecedented 70% in 2000. In 1970, only 37% of deliveries were held in official health facilities, while by 1985 such number had risen to 96% and by 2000 it was close to 100%. According to a political analyst, almost all health data transport Portugal from the third world to the first in 2 decades. In 1970, only 3.8% of teenagers were enrolled in high school. Such number rose to 28% in 1990, 59% in 2000 and 71% in 2010. The illiteracy rate was 26% in 1970. By comparison, in Spain it was 9% and declined to 11% in 1990 and 5% in 2010. In housing, major improvements happened. In 1970 only 47% of households had piped water supply and 68% had access to electricity. Historical data shows that in 1991, 86% of households had piped water supply and 98% had access to electricity. Congratulations, you made it to the end of this video. You are now officially an expert in the history of Portugal. If you want to become smarter by watching more knowledge videos, don't forget to leave a like, write down a comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching.